Welcome to the Stubborn Love Podcast. I'm your host, Paige Bond. I'm a Gottman and attachment trained, solution focused marriage and family therapist. I specialize in helping folks design and build their dream relationships through structured therapy and resources, and also use modalities that go beyond traditional talk therapy, like accelerated resolution therapy and psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. School didn't teach us how to be good at love, so I created the Stubborn Love podcast to help you navigate it. Every episode has actionable tips that will help you create a happier, healthier, and more fulfilling life with the people you love. Join me on this journey of love and learning for the stuff they didn't teach you in relationship school. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Now let's get ready to rock and roll. Welcome back to another episode of Stubborn Love today. I'm your host, Paige Bond, and we have a really special guest on this episode today. We're going to be talking about short-term relationships. So, Anthony, I don't think I can do you a justice of a good introduction. So, can you introduce yourself and tell listeners a little bit more about you? And then we'll dive into more on the topic of short-term relationships.
I don't know if I can do myself justice either, but just to keep it quick, I am a author mainly of poetry and philosophy, and you can find my stuff with a Google search of my full name, Anthony David Vernon, and maybe you'll run into something you like, maybe you'll run into something you disagree with, but that's basically a good summary of what I do. I write a lot and I overthink.
Yeah. And so you were already telling me before we started recording that you kind of write about taboo topics. So one of them, you said your first book was about death. Today, we're here to talk about short term relationships. Before we even dive into these things, what caught your attention about really talking about these more taboo topics?
I think what caught my attention is that a lot of the topics that are the most taboo, I think, say the most about people and society and culture at large. You know, what says the most is what's not said quite often, or, the assumptions, the most common assumptions, right? So it's like, oh, like we, have to think this way about death. We have to think this way about love. We have to think this way about government. So when you look into those other fringe topics, there's also a lot to be said there. There's also a lot more to be uncovered because the topic is taboo. There's also a lot to explore. So I think there's kind of a real like treasure trove of reasons why people should dive into taboo topics, in all sorts of backgrounds, fields, etc.
I agree. I love taboo. I think it's so much fun just like diving into these and learning more about things that either may not even be related to me, but I'm just exploring the topic itself and just gaining new perspectives of people or just trying to find something else and expand my own life. So, in particular, short term relationships, where did this kind of get sparked for you, this idea of short term relationships?
I think focusing on short term relationships as the place where love resides, as opposed to the long term relationship, I think really came from a manner in which I live. I try to live in a very sort of, going into one thing, going into the next, going into one thing, going into the next. I live in a very passionate sort of means. And, I realized in examining myself and others, the time period in which they love anything they get into the most, whether it be, a new video game or, whether they're trying out DJing for the first time, no matter where it may be, the love is really in those initial phases for the most part. And, having that sort of feeling that you had at the beginning of something towards the end of something is where, love is found. But most of the time, love is found in like really brief sort of period, and then people lose interest. So it's sort of that feeling of passion for me where I saw love reside as opposed to any sort of long-term contractual commitments.
Yeah. And when you talk about the idea of short-term relationships, I'm often like brought to the idea of the relationship escalator and how not everybody has to follow these same societal norms that we have expectations for, or, of the getting married and having the kid and having these types of commitments. We
Mhm.
can step off that escalator and still experience very fulfilling and deep experiences of love, even though it may not be what society tells you it is.
Yeah, I like to write that people aren't albatrosses. Albatrosses are amongst the most monogamous animals in the animal kingdom. And it's not that people can't be monogamous. There are certainly benefits to a monogamous society or a monogamous relationship. But at the same time, people aren't wired in the same way as albatrosses. The majority of our species history is not a, monogamous history. And so it creates these conflicts in people where from a society and sociological standpoint, you could look at these, benefits in terms of maintaining peace and order and stability. But at the same time, from a personal, emotional level, it can be very damaging for many people who don't fit in that sort of structure, who can't make themselves fit in that structure. And again, there's nothing even wrong with, being, polyamorous for a time or, being a player for a time and then moving into monogamy. But then there's also many, you know, cultures and groups and religious organizations that are just even against that sort of understanding of even transitioning into monogamy, figuring out what you like to work into monogamy. So I think that sort of thing is also valid. So I'm not trying to be out here and be like, aha, we should only have short-term relationships. I think rather it's best to explore the fling as sort of an option and a really good option for many, as opposed to using it like a bludgeon in the same way that heterosexual monogamy has been used as a bludgeon in many cases.
Yeah, I really appreciate that outlook because, as you may know, I specialize in working with people navigating non monogamous relationships. And so, a lot of what I think people get confused on is that, like, I'm over here waving a flag saying that everybody should be non-monogamous, and that's not necessarily the case. I'm just trying to be that voice uplifting that this is an and so you mentioned flings and you mentioned having a book, Flings on Flings. Can you say a little bit more about like what that was about?
Well, the fling for me is the romantic example of where love can be found. When you fling yourself into something, right? Obviously, the fling both refers to, at least in English, to the idea of a short term relationship, but also throwing yourself into something. The most passionate mountain hiker is the starter mountain hiker. And only are we able to maintain our love for something if we're able to continuously fling ourselves into it, continuously throw ourselves into it. I mean, the best marriages are those where there's a constant fling, there's a renewal, a revival. And I think this as a basis for love is better than a contractual understanding of love from a emotional standpoint, because I think a lot of people treat relationships like contracts rather than as flings of passion, which I think that mixes up ideas and understandings. Love becomes this very large thing. The Greeks have so many terms for love. It just becomes so, I think, bothersome to even navigate, between them, navigating between eros and agape. And so I think also part of it was reducing the definition of love to, a similarity, a form of passion, because I think there's too many muddled up definitions of love. So I think that was also a big part of the project, is also just kind of giving a middle finger to the Greeks and being like, no, 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 too many definitions. No, stop, stop, stop.
Yeah, it can get a little complicated having so many different variations describing one thing, but it's a really big thing. Love is huge and really hard to describe, I think, and put into words. One thing that gets me thinking for like relationships to work, love is not enough. I like to spew that idea everywhere. And I do think of relationships as a contract, right? You can kind of like exit at any time. And love isn't going to be the only thing keeping you in there. And so I kind of want to go back and forth on this idea about the contract of where do you think people get it wrong when it comes to love as a contract and staying in a relationship as a contract?
Well, I think it goes back to something you just said, which I disagree with, that you can't have a relationship solely based upon love. Of course, you can have
Oh,
a
yeah.
relationship solely based on passion. And I think it can be actually a healthy relationship. I think this is a made problem where it's like, oh, you can't sustain passion, it's going to burn out. Okay. Candles burn out. Lots of things burn out. Rather than creating structures in which a burnout is a bad thing, right? Because you burn out the contract. It's okay to have structures in which a burnout is okay and not going to be damaging. Like no worries, we put the candle around the lake, like it will be fine. We're not going to burn anything. So I think that's where the problem lies, where I think people often get into contracts where a better relationship dynamic for them would have been something else. People get into longer engagements than they should have. I like to use the term that people write contracts with rose colored lenses, right? That you write the contract often when you're in the fling. And that's not the time to write a contract. A contract with in a relationship sort of sense should be made when you know you have care and companionship for the other, right? It's going to be about your own, like, oh, what does this person do for me, right? Like a true love and companionship and care have one structure in common, the other, but they're a very different type of understanding towards that other, right? One's a passionate understanding for the other, one's a caring understanding for the other, one's a companionship understanding for the other. And, and that's another thing. I think too many people are very self motivated in relational dynamics, and they're very disattached from the needs, understandings, desires, et cetera, of the other. So this is where contracts go wrong when a contract is made for one's like self benefit. They're like, what am I getting out of this deal? It's like, no, it's not what you're getting out of this deal. It's about what you're giving out of these sorts of engagements.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really fair to say, and I do agree with you on the fact that not all relationships are meant to be long term. Like maybe a relationship that you're entering into is one that you explore and discover like a lot of things about yourself, but that's not a long term person that you would want to wake up to every day. And that's okay that that's not that relationship for you. I like to say there's no right way to do relationships. I mean, we change and evolve so many times over our lifetime. It would be unfair to expect, just this one thing, and this is why I really like to bolster the idea of non-monogamy as a choice for people. As you learn more about yourself, your sexuality can change, the way you love people can change, and that would be really unfair to not explore that because then you would be living a life where you could be unfulfilled.
Yeah, and I think I'm not sure if it's even about self-fulfillment. I mean, that doesn't hurt, but I think the issue in large part is that we're not focused upon the fulfillment of like others, right? Like so much of modern society is very social media based, and it's very much about the promotion of oneself, accentuating oneself, fulfilling oneself. And I think we've lost a lot of appreciation for, otherness, for difference. It's very easy, despite having access to global understandings, to streamline ourselves into an algorithmic form of thinking and to promote one corner of the world as the greatest corner of the world to ever exist, where I think people have lost appreciation for things outside of their realm of comfort and understanding. There seems to be less of a desire to go anywhere too far, despite having more travel access than ever. Not to say that people don't do it and there aren't van life people and like, Japanaboos who, don't like, obsess over living in Japan. But it's just to say that, if we look overall, I mean, people are more and more, I think, shutting themselves in. And I think it's because of this really bad conflation of, love as an act of self-fulfillment rather than as other appreciation and as other passion.
What do you think, could be changed to help with that mindset? Like earlier education, like what should people be diving into and learning about to know this other alternative?
I think the other alternative is to finally realize that self-love is an absolute disease. It is a really nauseous idea upon society because what it does is that when you go about self-love, you create an other version of yourself, right? You create the sort of ideal of yourself that you put your love and you put your care into, this sort of narcissistic sort of figure that you create that is not you but is a representation of you, and you love that and you put your energy into that. And yes, of course, it's part of you, but what it does, it turns oneself into an other and takes away all that love energy that you could have had for others and puts it not even into yourself but into a sort of figure, an idea of yourself. So I think that's the thing that really needs to be called out, is that we need to stop promoting self-love as a good idea because there are so many, at least to me, easy argumentations of why self-love is a harm to people and why the promotion of self-love is quite damaging, especially given that's like one of the biggest things promoted through social media, right? Through the biggest age of self-love promotion through social media, we just see depression rates going higher and higher and higher because people don't have an appreciation for anything, right? They lose their appreciation for their actual selves because they're too busy trying to appreciate this thing to self-love, but that's just an image. And then they've lost all exterior appreciation of just, things beyond their, I guess, kind of ego trap, to put it in complex terms.
Yeah. Is there a replacement?
For self-love, yeah, I think it's self-care. I think the problem is people aren't well attuned to their actual needs. While I think the Stoics are quite broy and obnoxious in any way, especially that like good guy who got a business degree that tells you to read Marcus Aurelius, nonetheless, they're really good at promoting the notion of like self-examination and self-inspection and looking at one's actual self or where they are, what they need to attend to, because it's very easy to very much be like, I love myself. Therefore, I do not need to change myself. This is something, Zizek kind of points to in an opposite sort of way, where it's like, is it love if you want to, absolutely like change the other, you know? So there's these two kind of conflicting, ideas. It's like, oh, I have self love and I don't need to change. And that creates a problem, or I have self love and I need to completely change to become this other image. And people kind of lie in those extremes of self love rather than actually examining themselves, who they are, for their strengths, their weaknesses, etc., and see how they can accentuate different aspects of their true self that they want to bring about, rather than be like, oh, I love myself, so I should be, more like this person, or, you know, I love myself, so I don't need to change at all. There's nothing I need to accentuate. There's nothing I need to, work on.
Yeah, I think that brings up a good point of as people, there's always things to work on, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's actually a really good and positive thing to grow and learn more about yourself and learn how to love yourself more. So you brought up the aspect of self-care. Can you speak on how you view self-care, what it is, and how we can really promote that within ourselves?
I think in order to promote self-care, there needs to be an honesty. And I think one of the things that, and I say this as a lefty individual myself, that, a correct push towards political correctness, should definitely put everyone in the limelight and be attentive to everyone's needs and not be hateful towards others. But simultaneously, there are certain forms of political correctness that don't allow for any examination of sort of problematic tendencies. My go-to example is self-diagnosis on TikTok. There are way too many individuals right now who are self-diagnosing with autism, for example. Why do I speak to autism? I'm not a diagnostician in autism by any means, but both my mother and my sister are speech pathologists, and there are too many people that do not have any medical background who are just saying, "Oh, I'm autistic, I'm this, I'm that," without the proper ability to do so. And, given current political correctness, that can't be called out properly in a social sense, right? Someone who is self-caring does not do that. Someone who is self-caring would look at their weaknesses properly and be like, I'm not a diagnostician. Maybe I shouldn't just go on the internet and say I have autism when I may or may not. Not to completely deny this individual, but one should not make diagnostic claims until they have multiple opinions, to say the least, not just, their own, oh, I looked through a bunch of TikToks, so I'm totally this. You may be this, and it's a good hint, it's a good sign, right? Like if you think you have something, you go to a doctor to check. But, that becomes a sort of a self-love thing. Then they create these TikTok pages that are all about like self-love for autism. And while this image may be true, you can't really know for sure what truly has been created is this other image, and this is gonna sound weird out of context, but the autistic form of this TikToker, becomes the image, the thing to be loved, as opposed to one's actual self that needs to be taken care of, that may have, a mild communicative disorder that's not being properly addressed because the individual has jumped all the way into autism. or, the individual may have a speech impediment as opposed, to Asperger's. So I think, this is, I guess, the example I like to use. And it is I think, a real life example of the note difference between self-love and self-care, because self-love, I think, is sort of, creating an idea, where self-care, points to actual features of reality. And not that images of self-love aren't based on nothing, but more often than not, they're based upon things that people want to be as opposed to things that people actually are.
I wanted to take a quick break from this episode to make sure you knew about this. If jealousy has ever crept in your relationships and left you feeling overwhelmed or out of control, I have just the thing for you: my Calm the Chaos Jealousy Workbook. It's packed with strategies to help you manage and transform jealousy into a force for growth and connection. And the best part? It's completely free. Just head over to my website at paigebond.com or check out the link in the show notes to grab your copy and start calming the chaos today. Now, let's get back to the episode. And I think people often forget when we go through mental health diagnoses. I mean, I'm a trained clinician, and we have this big ass book that we have to go through of what the diagnosis is, all the criteria for it, and then underneath all that are what's called differential diagnosis. So making sure that we are ruling out all of these other possibilities that this could be. So I think people oftentimes don't go through that process of ruling out these other things, and then
Yeah.
it could be that they're going through with, thinking and believing they might have a diagnosis when they could actually be something else
Yeah,
going
the
on.
DSM is not an easy read. You don't go about the DSM as like casual reading. It's not your cafe book by any means.
Definitely not. It is your graduate school book.
But yeah, and I think, this has moved a little bit away from short-term relationships, but I think this is an important distinction, because I think one is better able to be a participant that is there for someone other than themselves if they have a better sense of self-care. I think in the age of self-love that we're seeing now, we're also seeing less people get into romantic relationships despite more transportational access and apps like Tinder and Bumble, giving very easy access to meeting people that are more like you. All the tools are there to be in a neo-sexual revolution, but we're finding ourselves in a Victorian age somehow, despite all these, technological advantages. Yes, in the United States, there's current issues with birth control that are getting in the way of that. Yes, we are post sexually transmitted diseases that did not exist during the sexual revolution, but we have an education system that could very easily, explain to individuals how to prevent STIs. My ex-girlfriend she taught sex education in public schools, and it's not material that's ungraspable to middle schoolers, to high schoolers. And it's the type of stuff where you can very easily prevent a lot of sexually transmitted diseases, everything from pubic lice to, gonorrhea, etc. So it's just to say that, despite, some mild disadvantages, there's more advantages in favor of having a neo-sexual revolution, but we're kind of in this Neo-Victorian age where everyone is showing themselves off, but no one's doing anything about it. The numbers show less people are getting into relationships, less people are having sex,
Less
despite all
babies.
less babies, despite all these ideas, despite polyamory becoming more popular, despite Tinder, being in the atmosphere, despite religiosity going down. It's a very strange phenomenon. And I really think there's this factor that's not being connected to, which is the increase of depression and understandings of self-love, or the thing that is getting in the way of people fucking. It sucks. We need more fucking.
Yeah, I mean, when you're depressed or when you're anxious, who is in the mood, right? I want to go back to thinking about like who is the ideal fit for a short-term relationship. If I'm someone navigating the relationship sphere and I'm kind of having this idea of, ooh, Are short-term relationships good for me? Like, what
Mhm.
would be the signs to know?
No, that's a good question, but I think the best sign is someone who has a natural aptitude for passion. And I think that exists outside of necessarily, sexual feelings or romantic feelings, right? If you're someone that, quickly passionate about X, Y, and Z, if you're someone that's always constantly picking up new hobbies, short-term relationships may be for you. And this is not to treat people as hobbies. It's just to say that, like, if you're someone that has hobbies and you put a lot of care, time, and dedication into that hobby, then you could possibly be the type person that could put, dedication and care and time into another person. Again, it's not a one for one, it's imperfect, but it certainly is a best possible sign that I can think of on the spot.
Yeah. Is there like a timeline for how short these short-term relationships are compared to long-term ones, or it's arbitrary?
I mean, I wouldn't say it's arbitrary. I think short is any relationship that's pre-contractual, right? So the moment that two parties come together and decide, hey, we need to set terms on this relationship, right? And obviously, these aren't physically written out contracts, of course. I mean, most of the time it's just like you're having pillow talk and you're like, hey, like, are you seeing other people? No. Are you seeing other people? No. Like, do we wanna just see each other? Stuff like that. Like, when that starts, like, coming up, boom, it's over, right? That's when the short is over. So short is not inherent period of time. It's more of I guess, a before terms are set type thing. So a short could be
Yeah.
5 years of short. I mean, that might sound insane, but I guess, in the grand scheme of things, dinosaurs and Big Bang and all that jazz, 5 years ain't that much to go off of.
Yeah, compared to all the years that they could be together.
Exactly. Yeah, that's
Yeah,
true too. Yeah.
yeah. I like how you explained that there's not necessarily a number, but it's about maybe like the status of the relationship more so. Yeah. What are some signs maybe that someone would not be a good fit for short-term relationship?
I think a really good sign, and this might sound strange, is someone who never wants to leave their hometown.
Tell me more about that.
I think because it shows attachment, commitment, care, and compassion for a locality. And, a lot of what we do in long-term relationships is very settled. So if you're a settled person, like I found my corner of the world and this is the only corner and this is the best corner and I only want this corner, then it shows settled tendencies. And it's good for that person to find someone who wants to settle with them, who wants those routines with them, who wants, a lot of the same, and that's I'm not against a lot of the same for others, that would be against my whole philosophy, but it's just more to say that, like, for me, I'm someone who's very I know myself well, I'm like, "I need this thing, I need this thing, I need" for other people, they don't need much, and that is amazing if they do not need much for themselves, and that's the person who should be going after a long-term relationship. If that person goes after a short-term relationship, they're going to be thrown off left, right, center. It's like, why is this person into this? Why is this person into this? I don't like this. I don't vibe with this. Why do they want to be here? I just want to be here. So.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I'm also wondering, like, about the transition maybe from short-term relationship into a long-term one or vice versa. Like, do you have any advice or recommendations for people going through that transition period from one to the other?
I can't speak from personal experience by any means. I can only speak from philosophical experience in a weird way. There's a quote I really like from Nietzsche where most of marriages are about conversations. That the thing you do the most in a marriage is conversate. So a really good sign of figuring out if you're transitioning or not is figuring out in your relationships if you're starting to appreciate conversation more and more. I think for me, the relationships that have lasted the longest are the ones that I have the best conversations in as opposed to anything else. If I'm able to, speak with another person in really deep and insightful terms or just really goofy terms, because those are my two modes. I got no in betweens. So, so if I'm able to be really goofy or really deep with an individual, at least for me, that's the type of conversation that clicks. Now, for everyone, it doesn't have to be deep or, goofy conversations. But, for some people, if you have this really mutual passion for a lot of the same interests, or you have just a way that clicks even though you're not into the same things. So, yeah, I think that's the best way to transition is notice how you're conversating with your partner, partners, etc.
Yeah. This has been action-packed. We've gone over so much in such a short amount of time,
That's how I
but
try to write. So if you read any of my writing, it's a lot in a little. That's how I try to. I'm a flingy person in my writing also.
I like it. You exude that in all aspects of your life. Are there particular things that we haven't talked about yet when it comes to short-term relationships, flings, etc.?
I think one thing that has been dodged, speaking of taboos, is sex. I think that's a big thing that's been dodged. And, it's really easy to be philosophical about love and avoid sex. But really, it's a really important aspect to all of it. Now, I personally am not someone is a one night stand person. It's not like it's never happened for me before, but it's at the same time, it's just not my go to. It feels very seducery and it feels weird to me. Like I think of one night stands in a very seduction sort of way. When you're going about a one night stand, you're not appreciating the other for what they are. They become an object. And it's nothing wrong with that. I'm not anti-objective. In there are some scenarios where it's awful, but and I think most cases, but you know, mild objectification where it's consenting, everyone's cool with it, it's in small settings, it's not like spread en masse. Go ham. We all do it. So I think that's, something that's easy to overlook that, this idea that like, love is either super tied to sex or not tied at all. I think it's better to view sex as an activity within a relationship that for some people can be really, really important. I mean, some people like, having good sex is going to change their entire dynamic, going to change their entire, passion for somebody else, where other people, it's a nice thing to have, but it's not enough. And, obviously we have to account for asexual relationships where what does this matter? What does the sex matter? So I think it's best to view sex as an activity, something you participate in with a partner, more akin to the same way like you may play video games with a partner or the way you like to travel with your partner, things that really fill up quality time. And oddly enough, I think sex can be used to create good room for conversation. Sex puts you in a really intimate setting, the whole pillow talk thing. And I think often sex gets misused for pure pleasure in the physical sense as opposed to a mutual outlet for physical pleasure and I think intimate conversational pleasure in a weird sort of way for many people. Not for me, but I think a lot of people find the idea weird where it's like if some people just don't want to talk at all after sex. It's like, all right, we fuck and we put on Netflix, which I think
Yeah.
that's happening more and more. And to me, that's so sad.
Well, I find that really interesting and maybe a possibility of, an indication of some sort of insecurity there where they're avoiding that more emotional closeness or like even just thinking about communicating about, hey, how was our sex? I like this, or please don't do that again. Like even those basic things
Yep.
to even just at least make your sex life even better. Yeah, those conversations aren't really being had that often.
They're super important. And you put it so well. And I mean, you took any words I'd want to say about that out of my mouth.
Well, I am a therapist, so I try to make sure everybody gets everything in there.
And yeah, and and that's the thing. I think a lot of thoughts on love, oddly enough, overlook psychology in a weird way. Despite it being such a psychological phenomenon, it gets often reduced to almost a religious and moral sensibility. And I'm not sure if that's where love belongs or if that's a healthy place for love to belong in these sort of moralistic and religious senses. I mean, I get the extreme passion for religious, understandings. I've done religious studies and I understand, certain people's reverence in for their higher power, but I think when that gets kind of equated to, the love that you'd have for a romantic partner, like if that same word is used, I mean, you're clearly once again going back to mixing up ideas. And then this whole idea of, love being like good or bad, or like, you need to have this love and this type of love. I think this, creates the problem where people get tied up into, dynamics that they feel they need to attain rather than dynamics that actually fit their self care.
Yeah, there's a lot of gray area that I think we don't really acknowledge that can actually be really good for us. for us to
Yeah.
explore. Things don't have to be so black and white.
Yep. Yeah, love is not a it's not red or pink. It's, it's the, there's all the heart emojis on Apple for a reason. You got your green hearts, your black hearts, your purple hearts, all that sort of jazz. And that might be a weird metaphor, but there's good reason to, think of love also as this very deep thing. Because while I've tried to use a simplifying definition of love as like passion for the other, that still captures a lot of things. At once, I've created a simplified definition that turns love into this thing that you point at. Like you don't point at yourself, you point at something other, but there's so many other things, right? And so it still creates this keeping love as a broad thing, which, I think simplifying the definition to something, with like too much restriction, I don't think anyone would have ever attached to. I think this idea of, making love this super hyper specific thing that just gets thrown out the door. So I think even in my simplification, you still end up with lots going on because there should be lots going on because I think passion should be dismissed as it often is. People passion should get overlooked. I mean, what are we living for if we're not living to be, passionate?
Yeah, I mean, who wants to live maybe a more lifeless or boring life? I mean, and let me
Marriage
re
people.
but I'm trying to think, I did just watch, this weekend for the second time, Everything Everywhere All at Once, right? And there's so many different ways that we can go with our life, and I don't wanna boil down relationships to mean that they are boring or unfulfilling, if we just wanna be doing taxes and laundry with our partner, because that's such a beautiful thing too.
Oh yeah.
But also, is it fulfilling though? We wanna make sure it's fulfilling, and I think that's where that passion comes
Yeah.
in for you.
Yeah, and if you're fulfilled by taxes and laundry, amazing, right? That's the thing. I think when I made the diss on marriage, it's like there's too many loveless marriages out there, man. And it makes sense. You get caught up. I mean, you end up in, circumstances, kids, taxes, houses. There's so many things that like tie you down. And going back to the monogamy is beneficial, which I said earlier for stability and etc. The countries with the highest rates of polyamory in the world have very mixed results. But a lot of them are Central African countries that have a lot of other things going on, which are socioeconomic issues, in part due to the, I guess, instability of individuals not being in stable household. But at the same time, when your whole economic structure is centered around having that particular type relationship, I think that also creates problems. I think while and I'm not saying this as an anti-capitalist, more of just a critic of that when you have a economic system that, says it has all these freedoms and says it has all these options, but then gives you like tax credits if you only have specific types of marriages, if it doesn't let you foster kids, if you don't have specific types of relationships, if you don't fit certain social norms, then you're not going to be benefiting as much from the economic system. And so, it creates a lot of stability.
Agree.
One girl gets one dude, like that's it. They're stuck. Like that's very stable, but like stability at what cost? And I think there are ways to create societies where you maintain monogamy if you want monogamy, polyamory if you want polyamory, asexuality if you want asexuality, and make sure people are fine. Our institutions don't have to be entirely based upon marriage between heterosexual men and heterosexual women to maintain, order. I mean, we've seen this in the very small period of time in the United States that, LGBTQ individuals have been able to get married and it's been fine. No problems, no confusion. No one's like, "Oh god, what's this marriage institution? We can't." No, plenty of, the straightest, blondest people from Oklahoma. They're still getting their marriages. So
Yeah. It doesn't cause any harm to the other side who already had those privileges. Well, thank you so much for being a guest today on the show. I'm curious for listeners who are more intrigued by this topic of short term relationships or talking about these different ways of love and self care, like what projects do you have going on or where can people find you?
I rather than I think shouting out myself, because I already said that you can find me on Google pretty easily. I think one of the most influential authors on my work is Emmanuel Levinas. He's very dense to say the least, and he's not the most accessible, but that's a good source if you're like, oh, and this philosophical stuff was cool. Like, let me get real deep into it. If you're looking, I guess, for, something, I guess, more casual to like work your way into a lot of the things we talked about today, the YouTube channel ContraPoint, love her, love her stuff, amazing YouTube channel. So if you haven't checked out ContraPoint, not that she needs any more promotion by any means, but yeah, I've even done a university lecture on ContraPoint. So yeah, if you want, same sort of ideas about love, relationships, self-love, self-understanding, ContraPoints is an amazing thinker in examining these sorts of ideas.
Very cool. Well, thank you for giving me and those listeners resources like that to kind of expand more upon what you talked about today. I appreciate it.
No problem. Have yourself a great night.
Yeah, thank you, Anthony. And that's a wrap for today's episode of Stubborn Love. I hope you gathered some wisdom to bring into your love life and improve your relationships. If you enjoyed today's chat, don't forget to subscribe and leave a review. That'll help this episode reach even more listeners. If you have any questions or stories you would like me to cover in the future episodes, drop me a message. I love hearing from you. If you need extra support in your relationships, check out how we might be able to work together by hopping on my website at paigebond.com. Until next time, don't let being stubborn keep you from secure love. Catch you in the next episode.